together. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
All right, well, thank you everybody for returning. Hope that you learned something from last week and are ready for the kind of next step of this story. When I drafted this syllabus, I did it just, think I know what I'm talking about. I think I know where the turning points are, but I've never quite divided up from 1700 to 1865. So it's 165 years that I'm going to be covering tonight, and there's a lot that happens in them. Last time I covered 300 years, but there's almost a way when you cover that much time, you can do it in these gigantic blocks. Things you're painting with a broad brush, but still stuff makes reasonable sense. So I'm going to be pursuing a particular theme tonight. The theme is the theme of power. It's not horribly original, but it's really quite horribly important for understanding this, and also for understanding racial discrimination and stereotypes and those kinds of things. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to the screen share. Hopefully this will work. And okay, I'm disabled from it right now, so if I could be undisabled or abled. Should I give it another? Tell me when I should give it another shot.
Okay, so is Stewart a co-host?
Oh, we need to make him a co-host.
And my co-host. All right, so let me screen share. Can y'all see that?
We see it.
You can see that?
We see Zoom.
It says Zoom.
Okay.
You shared your desktop.
Yeah, so if you're able to separately open whatever document you want to share, and then reshare the screen and select that document, it should bring us there.
All right, how about now?
I think you need to stop sharing first.
Okay.
Now share screen, and it'll give you a choice.
Got it. Okay. Now.
Yes.
Can you see something? Okay, excellent.
Perfect.
All right. These are some of the slides that I used last time, including these of the European slave trade of the Slavs, what was going on in Northern Africa. That's kind of where we started. And then the transatlantic slave trade, transporting anywhere between 10 and 12.5 million people. By the way, that was a very good shot, that still shot that you took, that you put on the church's website of this. That was well chosen, in my opinion. Just want to kind of remind you of what we've done and what we've talked about a little bit, and want to return to this map. And I asked the question last time just to kind of put a point on this. It's 1660, and King Charles II is on the throne. His main priority, his main kind of economic engine of the English Empire is this tiny little island of Barbados. We talked about that, talked about Jamaica. And I concluded by talking about the very different, although they seem to look really similar, and ultimately they are really similar, but they have really different histories of Virginia. South Carolina starting out as a slave colony from day one, Virginia transitioning into a slave colony over the course of the 1600s. And that's kind of where I wanted to stop and bring it up to essentially the year 1700, just to kind of use a round number. And so I could say the word 18th century, but then people have to do math. So I'm used to teaching so much, I just say things like the 1700s. So over the course of the century of the 1700s, that's the first thing we're going to be talking about today. So this presentation tonight has 3 parts, moving in chronological order. First, the age of these empires. And so I'm going to talk about these empires and the role slavery played in them, then the American Revolution, then the real kind of heart of this and the horror of this, antebellum slavery, and leading up to the Civil War and emancipation. So, and the reason why I go back this far, again, these dots connect, and I want to kind of show them and not skip really important steps in telling this story. Okay, so over the course, so if you can think of the 1600s, and I have some notes that I took just because I wanted to stay focused, because this could go in a million different directions. So I'll have to pause every now and then just to stay on track. I know the material, but I just want to talk about the relevant material and not go down rabbit holes. If you think of the 1600s as kind of a time of imperial trial and error, the French, the Dutch, the English all get out into the Atlantic. They definitely engage in the slave trade, just like the Portuguese and the Spanish were, and they start gobbling up territories. And some of these things fail, some of them succeed. When they succeed, they make those countries, those empires, fantastically wealthy, whether it's off of gold and silver mined by slaves usually, or a staple crop, sugarcane, especially later coffee, rice, tobacco, these kinds of things. So 1600s is just a mess. It's actually one of my favorite centuries to teach because it's just incredibly dynamic and incredibly weird and a lot of fun, although it's also pretty violent and horrible in a lot of ways. The 1700s, what gets established in the 1600s gets further consolidated and kind of wrapped up in the 1700s. So the main story that I want to tell here is not really one of development necessarily, of going from A to B to C as something kind of goes through a life cycle, as it is the form and the systems are pretty much established by 1700 for the most part, and then they just grow and they get stronger and more kind of entrenched in what historians call, and I really like this term, the Atlantic world. So rather than just thinking of colonial America or what's going on in Europe, think of all of these worlds, all of these continents, Europe, North America, South America, and Africa being linked together in these systems of trade, which also involve very much slavery. Okay, so, just to, a couple of things about British history, just to kind of throw this in, and I do this largely because the United States is inherits British culture and British traditions. So it's kind of important to understand that, but I'm not meaning to give it necessarily more attention than others. In case you don't know this, in the year 1688, there's this absolutely huge thing that happens in British history called the Glorious Revolution, where King James II flees. They invite William and Mary to be the king and queen of England. He basically invades. And why this is important is the problem of government. Okay, who's in charge, the king or parliament, is ultimately solved in many ways by the Glorious Revolution, and in a system that's called king in parliament. That where the buck really stops, as is decided in 1688, is parliament, and the king is in some ways second to parliament. This matters because the issues of government, there's no more civil wars in England. And also, when I talk about the American Revolution in just a little bit, the American revolutionaries looked back to 1688 as when England got it right, and what we American revolutionaries are fighting for. And I will connect all of this back to the subjects of slavery and racism in just a little bit, I promise. Okay, so that's 1688. In 1707, this is the famous union between Scotland and England. What a lot of people don't know, what I didn't know, Scotland, and this is important for talking about these empires. Let me reduce the size of this just a little bit. So today, in case you don't know this, it's perfectly fine if you don't. England is England, the lower kind of 2/3 of the island. Scotland is Scotland. When they were united in 1707, that's what you call Britain, or Great Britain. That's a very short, easy way to describe it. Okay, here's why I'm talking about the Scots. The Scots, because they were Scots, were excluded from the goodies of the English Empire. Who gets to benefit from the English Empire? The English. The Scots were on the outside looking in as England's getting fantastically wealthy. They actually try something. Why I wanted to reduce this map. A bunch of Scottish, the members of the wealthy classes in Scotland got together to try a Scottish empire, to get in on some kind of colony. They established a colony down in Panama called Darien, and it's right smack in the middle of all of these Spanish possessions. The Spanish just sailed in on them and annihilated them. This happened before 1707. It bankrupted much of Scottish society, which is why the Scots agreed to be united to the English in the union that's existed ever since. So, and as a result of this, Scots could immigrate to be a part of the now British Empire. We don't call it the English Empire anymore, we'll call it the British Empire. Okay, I'm saying this just to point out the importance of all of these, of how lucrative empire was. Everybody wants to be in on it. The Scots ultimately get in on it. The Irish never do, and the Irish, as a result, stay poor. And that's going to figure into this in a little bit as well. Okay, this is going to be a kind of mental picture that I'm trying to create. It's going to be potentially a little weird, but just follow me if you can. Pretend it's the year 1720, and pretend you're a Scot born in the year 1700. And so it's 1720. Scotland has been united to England since 1707. You can get in on it. Things are not good in Scotland. You want to immigrate. And a lot of Scots did. Now, let's pretend this Scottish person shows up on the shores of the future United States of America. Let's just say it's Pennsylvania, for instance, or maybe Virginia, where there will be more enslaved people. Virginia. In teaching on this subject for however many years, there was this one paragraph in this one article that I read that I've not seen really developed as a theme anywhere else that I think is very, very important. And what I want you to do is put yourself in the shoes, in the mind of this Scot. All you've ever known is Scotland. All you've ever known is poverty. Now you're in America. It's the land of opportunity, and you're bumping into these people who look very, very different from you. Native Americans and enslaved Africans and African Americans. This one paragraph of this one book made this exceptionally good point, in my opinion, which was this. The European immigrant to the Americas, as they are encountering these two people who look different and have different cultures and languages than what they're used to, generally treated the native peoples with greater respect. And this shows up in our American culture down to the present. We have Native Americans on stamps. We have art of Native Americans. There's this one famous sculpture that I saw a kind of replica of just this past summer of the defeated Native American on horseback. He's just kind of slumped over with and the wind is blowing at his back. And it's incredibly sad, but there's still this nobility that shows through in the way the artist represented that. We don't have a tradition in this country of statues that memorialize slaves. Okay, I'll potentially come back to that a little bit later, but the point that I want to make about this is this Scottish person in 1720 encountering native peoples, because of the proximity of those native peoples' power centers, that European immigrant can recognize these people come from a great and proud and usually militarily accomplished culture. They're strong, they're warriors. They might not have some of the things that we have as Europeans technologically or whatever, but we still kind of admire that. But it's the proximity to those things. They're further off into the wilderness, but you're going to bump into civilizations that will impress you. A European American did not have that opportunity with enslaved Africans. Africa and the greatness of African civilizations is all the way on another side of the ocean, and all that this European immigrant sees in terms of Black people are enslaved people. That is going to have an effect on the way that that person perceives that entire race. People who look like that, then certain attributes are going to be foisted onto what Blackness means, what being Indian means, and what being European means. I said this in the last class, I believe, I am not a race theorist. If I were to take a race theory 101 and take the first exam in it, I would fail miserably. That professor would not give me a very good grade. So I'm not teaching race theory. I'm not trained in it. I am trying to teach the history of it. There's some ways in which I might be benefited from race theory. But these very complicated interactions of different cultures, different languages, and different appearances matter tremendously. But again, the theme that I want to be pursuing in talking about this tonight is power. And people respect, generally, power. People respect when a civilization has its act together. Oh wow, they really have it going on. They've got this, they've got that, they've got the Olympics, they have whatever, they've got great food. And then, oh, there's this other country that's just, completely falling apart and, whatever, their food is terrible, ... There's a greater, again, respect when civilizations have power. And when the only people of African descent that these Europeans are seeing are enslaved, again, that has an effect. Okay, I want to move forward in time a little bit here. And very quickly, again, there's this important thing called the French and Indian War. Okay, why am I talking about that? The British end up winning it. That then opens up the rest of North America to be owned by the British, not by the French. In the peace negotiations that took place in 1763 between the British and the French lose all of North America. The French actually give away, in 1763, they give away India, which is just colossally a boon for the British. That's the source of the future of the Second British Empire after American Revolution. Why did they do that? Because having lost in this war, the thing that they want to hold on to, which is the real moneymaker for their empire, is what we today call Haiti. They called it Saint-Domingue, but just to show you how profitable and how much at the front of European leaders' minds, the slave trade, the sugar trade, how valuable these things were. We, France, will give up India in order to hold on to Haiti. Okay, let me stop screen share for just a second. Does anybody have any question about anything that I've said so far? Because that's the time of empire and how, there's one thing that I'm sorry, I did not cover that I do want to cover, and that's this. Let me go to this here. All right, so here's the Atlantic world. And as these empires get consolidated, let's just talk about the British Empire, for instance. There's this thing that you've probably heard of before called the triangular trade. That is a historical reality. That's not a historical overstatement or a myth or anything like that. Finished goods from Europe being sailed down to Africa, traded with African powerful kingdoms for slaves. That's one side of the triangle. The next side of the triangle goes from Africa to the New World, bringing enslaved people. And then the third side of the triangle are the commodities, the tobacco, the sugar, the whatever being grown and produced in the Americas, which then goes back to England, goes back to Europe to be turned into finished goods. That's all true and accurate and right. There's one thing that complicates this that's very important. It's that as in these islands, in these West Indian islands, especially places like Barbados, they devoted every inch of that land to growing sugarcane. As a result of that, they couldn't grow their own food. It was what's called an economic monoculture. So they had to import absolutely everything else. And where those imports came from was the American mainland. So this is why when some people talk about, you might hear this on the news every now and then, Rhode Island. Rhode Island has this very close connection to American slavery. It was a port where slaves were bought and sold, but also Rhode Island and other parts of New England, all up and down the East Coast, they are the ones who sell to other British colonists on places like Barbados and Jamaica. These plantation owners, they sell them their food, their lumber, their nails, all of the things that one needs to to basically have a society had to be imported, and they were imported from these American mainland colonies. So even if those colonies did not have slaves like South Carolina and Virginia did, it's more further north, those colonies were intricately connected to a slave system, and their economy was similarly built on a slave system. Okay, that's the final point that I wanted to make about that. Does anybody have any question about that before I move on briefly to the American Revolution?
A small question. From my limited reading, there seem to be two kinds of slave cultures. One was work them to death and replace them, but bring only men. And the other was the US model, where they brought men and women and reproduced their slaves. Why did that happen in the US?
That you were asking a truly fantastic question, and I was going to hopefully bring this up sometime tonight. So thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I'm glad that you. I'm happier that you asked it. Okay, let me show this real fast again. Okay. This is disgusting, and for some weird reason, I think about this at least once a week. I don't know why. People can go around thinking about the horrors of the Holocaust or the horrors of this or that or whatever. For some reason, I honestly think about Barbados once a week, at least. I don't know why. About what happened there. To answer Bob's question, and I have to speak in incredibly gross terms here, the plantation owners made a strict economic calculation that it was cheaper to keep importing men and to use them with their greater upper body strength than it was to, and work them to death and replace them. And I don't know the specific calculation of why that was cheaper, but they made the calculation that it was cheaper to do that than to potentially feed them, clothe them, and house them well. And then also regarding women, yes, there's a horrible reality that in the American South, the child of a slave is further property for the slave owner. So it would seem like this is an economic benefit that the owners of Caribbean plantations did not do as much. And again, they're simply about making money. And a pregnant woman can't work. A woman who's just given birth can't work for however many years. And a child, although new property and new supposed added value to the plantation, is just a mouth to feed for the first 10 to 15 years. So again, this is a disgusting calculation of profits and losses. But they ultimately, the bottom line for them literally was work them till they die and replace them. Over time, the sex ratio gets evened out, but it was much closer to 50-50 in the Americas kind of from the beginning. But Bob, that's a very good question. There's some things about this that I might return to after or later in the talk today, but I'll just leave it at that. Does anybody else have any quick question you'd like to ask? Okay. American Revolution. Let me just find some map of America here, the East Coast. That'll work. Okay, this I'm going to do somewhat embarrassingly fast. Again, I want to keep us at an hour. So these are some notes I took on this. This might be a little bit disappointing, but I'm not going to say a ton here. If you do have questions about this, I'll gladly circle back to it. In order to stay focused on slavery, I'm only going to say a couple things about this subject as it relates to the American Revolution. But again, I'll gladly circle back if this is something you want to drill down on. First of all, and this actually relates to the controversy over the national anthem. Just to kind of put a point on this, and I'm not meaning to add to the controversy, just to say that there is the controversy. And there's I guess I don't know if I need the screen share right now. There's an unfortunate poverty in the symbols that we use when it comes, let's say, just to the national anthem. And you're either standing proudly and, my country, my mother, drunk or sober, and my country kind of no matter what. That's how that's interpreted sometimes. And then if you're kneeling, it means that you absolutely hate the United States of America. I don't agree with that at all. But unfortunately, this has turned into a kind of a culture war issue where you either stand with America or you're some kind of communist, infiltrator trying to destroy America and can't stand it. I think that's very problematic. I don't know all of you who are in the church. I look forward to getting to know you more. I never know my students at the beginning of a semester. It's always something new. And people can be coming from all different perspectives on this. I've recently come up with what I think is a decent way to explain what I'm trying to do as we talk about this, honestly, as a country, which is, for me as a historian, what I want to do when I talk to whoever you are, whether you are liberal, conservative, indifferent, if you tend towards more of the my country, right or wrong, my mother drunk or sober, and I'll, stand by the flag. What I would like to show you is America has some things that are pretty ugly and hypocritical and inconsistent and unjust that should be acknowledged, and that actually contribute to the making of the United States in the first place. If you're one who just, okay, I can't stand the United States of America, it's nothing but a bunch of hypocrisies, I'd also like for you to move to the middle in that the United States actually has some fantastic ideals. I like to describe it as the United States has the greatest ideals ever articulated that any country has never lived up to, including the United States of America. And with that, let me move on to the American Revolution. Again, my aim is to move you a little bit closer to the middle, to think about the other side, maybe to take a step closer to the other side. Okay, and I want to focus in particular when it comes to the American Revolution, and this very much gets us to the subject of the entire 4 classes in tonight's class as well, the American Revolution's claim to be about equality. This claim of human equality and the equal treatment of human beings is at the center of the American Revolution, and it's at the center of America's hypocrisies as a country. Although, again, I believe that America is one of these countries that absolutely has not lived up to its own ideals, although it has articulated those ideals. The short version of the American Revolution is that it was about no taxation without representation. I teach an entire semester on this. I could go into much greater detail. These American colonists were screaming for their political rights, political representation and voice in very much the same way that English people are screaming for this in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That's why I wanted to make sure to mention that. American colonists felt aggrieved, felt that they were treated unfairly, and by God, they're going to fight back. Give me liberty or give me death. They felt that they were being treated as slaves. They actually used that language. There's a famous Brit, Samuel Johnson, who said, why is it that we hear the loudest yelps from liberty from the drivers of slaves? Just pointing out very fairly American hypocrisy on this issue. All right, so let me quote to you the Declaration of Independence. This is a certain form of American scripture, probably the most famous line in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's arguably the most famous sentence in American history. And I think it's the most beautiful ideal that America has ever articulated, and again, not lived up to fully. Created equal, all men being equal. I describe American history as, this can get me in trouble sometimes with some other historians who think I'm being a little too soft on the United States, but the expansion of that definition of all men to include more and more people over time, I believe is the American story, and we're still not 100% there yet. Okay, the key point and the takeaway that I want to talk about regarding slavery in the American Revolution is that it was the existence of this economic foundation based on racial slavery, which enriched these Virginia planters especially, that allowed those white American founding fathers to conceive of the possibility of equality with one another, and especially equality with Great Britain. This other group, enslaved Africans and African Americans was inexcusably left out of the picture and considered invisible. We can talk about equality because we're not talking about this other group. We can cheer to equality and toast to equality. Let's pretend it's 1776, while the meal that we're eating right now was prepared by enslaved people that we're not talking about. And that is in many ways the foundation of our economy. I'm talking as if I were an 18th century patriot. And then a certain recognition of, oh yeah, they need to be included too. It's a slow realization, although a realization that people of color made very, very fast, but that was kind of a bit slower to dawn on the white founding fathers, who I revere, I think very highly of. And I think very highly, honestly, of the American project. And this is where I will unabashedly, as an academic, academia and academics are generally considered kind of left of center. I consider very much myself a patriot. I love the United States and I love what it stands for. I'm just interested in it living up to its ideals more fully than it has. Okay. Again, I gave you no real details about the American Revolution. It's kind of not super important. Obviously, there's a hypocrisy that the man who wrote these words not only owned slaves, but had children with one of his slaves, and those children remained slaves in his family. There's just horrible, horrible things to digest and make sense of. All right, the Constitution, written in 1787, does include slavery. It does not include the word slave. It does not include the language about slavery. But this is where the infamous 3/5 clause comes from. This is also where there's laws about runaway slaves. And so the Fugitive Slave Act, that kind of thing. This would be controversial to some people, for sure. Some people would say, why didn't they talk about slavery more at the Constitution? Why didn't they abolish it or whatever? I always have problems with those woulda, coulda, shoulda type of things. It doesn't, I don't feel like it usually takes full advantage or full understanding of the things going on at the time, and that there are all these other problems that they had to deal with. Nevertheless, slavery remains as a legal institution after the Constitution is written and then ratified in 1787 and the few years after that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the real kind of time of the growth of American slavery, which is in between the American Revolution and the Civil War. But does anybody have any question that you'd like to ask about the American Revolution? Okay, here is again where I could, people might not like what I have to say about this and would be critical of it, because again, I'm maybe being a little bit too soft on the founding fathers. But here's something that is historically accurate. The Constitution was written in 1787. Slavery definitely has a stronghold in the United States, in South Carolina, in Virginia. So many of these founding fathers came from Virginia: Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Monroe, etc. So they knew that was their world. They were slave owners and they were planters. They definitely felt, at the very least, ambivalent about slavery. That doesn't necessarily, okay, well then why did you give it up? There's a lot that can be said there. And there was a sense that, and a hope, I think that it is accurate and fair to say that they hoped that slavery would die. It's difficult to find a founding father like, this is the greatest institution ever. Thank God for it. Let's, slavery now, slavery forever, rah, rah, the United States. That didn't really happen. I'm saying all of this to set up this point that I'm making right now. The Constitution's written in 1787 and ratified the following year. The cotton gin is invented in 1793. when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they did not foresee the power, the economic power that would come from cotton production. Also, the 13 colonies are limited to the eastern seaboard. They touch the Atlantic. The story after that is the cotton gin is invented in 1793. What the cotton gin does, in case you don't know, cotton, I've not as a job or anything, or even as an afternoon, but yeah, I've been in Alabama, I've been around cotton fields and went out and I picked some cotton. And then when you pull that cotton boll off of the cotton plant, the seed in it is very sticky. And it takes a lot of work to pull the seed out. When you pull the seed out, it takes a lot of the cotton fiber. The cotton gin is this machine invented by a Yankee, Eli Whitney, that separates out the cotton from its seed. That machine made cotton unbelievably profitable. I say this to my students every time I teach this. We are all, it's virtually guaranteed that we are all right now wearing something made out of cotton. We might be wearing nothing but articles of clothes made out of cotton right now. It's this fantastic fiber. People could not get enough of it, especially at a time when manufacturing of textiles is really pretty difficult. The cotton gin then explodes the production of cotton throughout the Deep South. Starting in 1793, and I like this. This is one of my favorite slides to use because the colors of where enslaved people were. It's just these gross colors, which I think is appropriate for when we're talking about slavery itself. South Carolina. This is a very important thing to say and realize. This is why I love geography and geology so much. I like talking to Lucy about this stuff. South Carolina does not really have any mountains in it. The Appalachian Mountains are here in Virginia and in Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, and down to a little bit of Alabama, but they barely touch Georgia. They touch Georgia a little bit, but they really don't touch South Carolina at all. Okay, why am I mentioning that? Who cares? You don't have plantations and you don't have slavery where there are mountains. This is why the entire western, however much portion of Virginia seceded from Virginia in the Civil War. Because, hey, we're a bunch of hillbillies here, but we don't have slaves, and we don't want to be a part of the slave-holding Confederacy. It's because of mountains. South Carolina does not have those mountains. The low country of South Carolina was devoted to rice. Then when the interior of South Carolina could be put to cotton cultivation, the entire state of South Carolina becomes basically like the island of Barbados, but they're just growing different things. This is incredibly important because it creates a very unique and unified and ultimately powerful political culture where disagreement is not tolerated in South Carolina politics. If you say, hey, I feel a little bit like you are run out on a rail. Other states that were more geographically diverse, like Virginia and Kentucky and even Alabama, that has some mountains, there would be representatives in their state governments representing slave interests, and then some representing we don't have slaves. So there's kind of a diversity of voices. Not so in South Carolina. When the cotton gin was invented, slavery spreads. You heard me introduce the metaphor of slavery as a cancer. Slavery, I think of it as getting this toehold, this tiny little toehold in the Americas before the American Revolution. It definitely solidifies over the course of the 1700s. It's entrenched, but then again, it's the cotton gin that just propels it into another level. And slavery, which already existed in the colony and then state of Georgia, then spreads across Alabama into Mississippi. This is the Mississippi River Delta, very fertile land here. This part of Alabama is called the Black Belt. It's actually called the Black Belt because of the darkness of the soil. It was originally called it because of the darkness of the soil, and the fertility of the soil then led to cotton production. And then most of the people living in this region of Alabama were enslaved Africans and African Americans. By the way, notice this for this upcoming election, in a couple weeks. If they do a national county by county, kind of which county went red, which one went blue, there's always this interesting thing where Alabama is red, except the map looks exactly like the map that I'm showing you right now, except that's in this kind of ugly brownish color is blue, because these counties are predominantly African American and the other counties are predominantly white. So there's this tie again, a certain theme that I want to be making in all of these classes is how these dots connect. These dots connect down to our political moment in 2020. Okay, slavery spreads. Slavery spread, and wherever the land is good, that's where people are going to establish their plantations and have their slaves. I have about 15 minutes left. This is actually going relatively quickly. There's a lot that I can say, but before I do, does anybody have any question that you'd like to ask me about kind of thus far? What I'm going to do next, let me just kind of preview it, is I want to talk about what antebellum slavery was like. So I am going to talk about that, this kind of in general. But does anybody have any question? And I am going to go back to the map. So yeah, Lucy.
I have just I hadn't understood this before. You're saying that basically slaves were not really present in Alabama and Mississippi until after the cotton gin came through?
There weren't that many settlers there.
Okay.
So actually, let me just show you this, because this, believe it or not, is an important map. This is one that I use in my classes all the time and return to repeatedly.
Oh.
Okay, take a look at this map. And the title of it is Westward Expansion up to 1830. Actually, I need to show you this other map as well. Okay. No, it's this map. Okay, Lucy, this I believe answers your question.
It sure does.
Indian resistance, 1790 to 1816. Okay, 1790, the Constitution, the ink is still drying on the Constitution, but it's a nice kind of solid date, 1790, not long after that to 1816, it's about 25, 26 years. The American colonists are all here on the East Coast, but westward expansion is going on. Settlers are moving into these Western places, and there are powerful Indian presence. There's a powerful Indian presence there. In both the North, in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and in the South, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. So again, kind of putting yourself in the shoes and in the mind of a potential frontiersman. Here I am living in Pennsylvania or in South Carolina. I don't really have many opportunities here. I want to go west, but I'm not going to do it because I might get killed. Because there are, and this was well known. Hey, what's going on with the Indians there? Well, there's a lot of battles and a lot of wars. Every one of these little explosions represents an Indian battle. There's one down here in Alabama I'm not saying this is the only time, honestly, except when we get to the civil rights movement, which I'll talk about in 2 weeks from now, when Alabama is relevant. There's not a lot of stuff happens in Alabama, but here's one of them, and it's the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, when Andrew Jackson, the future president and the man on our $20 bill, just annihilated these Creek Indians. But notice the date on that, 1814. So honestly, think before 1814, this is Indian territory. The native peoples of these lands dominate these lands. You're not going to move in there with by yourself, with your family, with slaves, without slaves, whatever. And then this map says a lot, both about that phenomenon of westward expansion, also the importance of when the war was over and the Indian resistance was crushed. Sorry that it doesn't show up very well in these colors here, but look at the states of Indiana, Illinois, Mississippi, and Alabama. What the date in parenthesis underneath the names, that's the year that those states were added to the Union. So as soon as the War of 1812 is over, which was against both the British and their Indian allies in places like Alabama with Battle of Horseshoe Bend, when the native peoples are basically knocked out, people flood into these regions, and in 4 years, a state is added to the Union every year. and notice that they were very intentional about balancing out northern states and southern states. Indiana, 1816, Mississippi, 1817, Illinois, 1818, Alabama, 1819. North, south, north, south. But that also, so that indicates a desire to balance out north and south, but that also indicates that there is an absolute flood and surge of people into those lands once the native peoples were knocked out. Okay, yeah. All right. Any other question anybody wants to ask about?
Stuart, may I ask a church history question?
Yeah.
So in the mid 18th century, mid 1700s, George Whitefield persuades John Wesley to come to the colonies to preach. Two good Anglican priests. Well, we could argue whether they're good or not, but they go there with the intention of preaching to the incarcerated Brits who have been brought over to the colonies to work. How large a population? I mean, how many hundreds or thousands of Brits were working on plantations besides slaves as cheap labor for the colonists?
It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that because it just depended on the time. And I would imagine that the authors of these laws in England, whether it has to be Parliament itself or if it can be just a more kind of local municipality, we're overcrowded. We got too many poor people. Let's ship them off. Let's incarcerate them for debt or just being homeless, and then we'll ship them off to some colony, whether it's Australia or Georgia or Barbados or whatever. But unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that. But it happened kind of episodically. Usually when there were these population pressures, and then the way to alleviate the population pressure is just ship them off to some place and you never see them again.
So my Yankee education, growing up in northern Pennsylvania, taught me that the core of the South were all outlaws because of that. And that, it really is a strong bias that education's not good in the South. Those people aren't law-abiding people. And I realized later it was because of that, the mythology that there were so many people that were unloaded from the prisons in the southern colonies. So I'm sure it happened. I've actually never, I'm a Southerner. I'd like to think I'm not a defensive Southerner. But I've never heard that, all those Southerners are just a bunch of convicts. Although maybe we are, or come from a bunch of convicts. I'm not sure. Yeah. So I'm confessing the bias with which I was raised. Yeah. Well,
I'll say this: the history I got in California never mentioned incarcerated prison colonies. That was more, they went to Australia, not to us, because it would have had to have been before the revolution. Correct. As well, Wesley and Whitefield would have been 20 years before the Revolutionary War.
Let me, Georgia, just to respect everyone's time, we have about 9 minutes left, and so I want to. Michelle, is that what you were saying, or was someone going to ask another question?
I was just going to say Georgia was established as a
was originally a colony for debt prisoners.
Yeah.
Okay, let me show this. Let me get back to this. This actually gets a little bit to Bob's question. When Bob asked, what's the difference, or he understood two different ways of that people operated plantations. Again, it's this kind of revolving door death camp, or actual kind of families. This is the way I teach it to my students. There's this very important comparison and contrast, similarities and differences between slavery as it came to exist in the Americas and slavery as it existed in the West Indian Islands. That says a lot and speaks a lot to what American culture became, and how it became that way. So let me put it this way. I kind of talked about this a little bit already when I was talking about British slave owners who would get out of their island. Okay, like go there, get it set up, and then go back to England as fast as possible. where you're not going to die of malaria or a slave rebellion or whatever, and do what you can to marry off your children to other wealthy Londoners. That's what's called being an absentee landlord or an absentee master. Same thing in places like Jamaica. People just didn't want to live there, so they go there. It's their moneymaker. It's honestly like an oil well. They go and they establish they get all the infrastructure built, and then they just want to pump revenue into their pockets, and it doesn't matter what damage it does. In the American South, there's this phenomenon of resident masters, of the owners of the slaves living on the same property as the slaves. This is really, really contested territory. That's a fact. But then what the relationships between the white slave holders and the enslaved people were like is very, very contested scholarly territory. And there's the range for basically whatever the spectrum of human behavior of one human being to another that was lived out in this dynamic. But what resident masters allow for is the actual possibility of recognizing the humanity of one another. The slave owner would recognize the humanity of the enslaved people. The enslaved people might actually recognize the humanity of the slave owner, and there can be a possibility of human connection there. Another thing that's very important about this, and this I think is in some ways more important. Let me show you this. Here's this fantastic little pie chart here. Slaveholding and class structure in the South, the date of it is 1830, but the most important part of it by far is this massive 2/3 chunk of the pie, which are non-slave holders. So this is in the South in 1830. Actually, as the South got closer to 1860 in the Civil War, this slice of the pie got larger. Fewer slaveholders owned more slaves the closer you get to 1860. And some people either ceased being slaveholders, or just the population of slaveholders, of non-slaveholders, got larger. This is the American challenge. These poor whites, and I say that as someone who comes from a background of poor whites. And why I say this is these are the people who were tasked with and experienced a fantastic psychological status boost. They help enforce the slave system. They're deputized as guards simply because of their white skin. They do not have a financial investment in the institution of slavery, but they have a psychological investment in the institution of slavery because it allows them to feel superior. This is why they went and fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, even though they did not, again, have a vested financial interest in keeping slave property because they had no slave property to begin with. But racism, and I don't know if I said this for this class, I try to use that word incredibly rarely because it can get flung about so much that it loses any meaning or any power. So if I use the word racist, I try to use it very specifically so that it maintains the strength of its meaning. A racist system where people walk around feeling superior because of nothing other than the color of their skin and feel entitled to tattle on people, tell the authorities on people who look different from them. And then also the writing of these laws. This is what we're going to talk about next week. Let me just say it now. It's kind of on my mind. There's no reason to kind of hide it. I'll preview it now and I'll develop it next week. I have a 5-word thesis that I think is worth considering. And the thesis is this. In America, order is racialized. In America, order is racialized. Now you can maybe say, well, in every country, order is racialized. Perhaps maybe we can look at other countries and talk about other countries later. But I want to talk about America. And for the most part, and I'm saying this as a white guy, but the laws were written predominantly by white people for white people. And then it's the enforcement of those laws. That's the thing that we're dealing with these days. is how law is enforced. But big surprise, and I'm not saying that this was just, let's all get together. What horrible things can we do? Ha ha ha, good for us white people. That did happen. It wasn't absolutely constant. But when laws are written that to the disadvantage of other groups of people, it's fair to call those laws racist, and to call that system of legislating in the first place and then enforcing those laws, it's fair to call that a racist system. And again, I try to do this very, very surgically almost in talking about some of these things. Let me point out this last thing, and then we can close with some questions. Okay, population patterns in the South. This is 1850. What's in purple are enslaved people. What's in blue are white people. South Carolina in 1850 was 57%, 58% Black. Guess the psychological impact that has on those white people. They are scared to death. They are very, very nervous because they know they are outnumbered. When I said, yes, there is a large population of whites in the American South, which was not what it was like in the Caribbean, but in some of these places, these whites are outnumbered. And whenever they feel that, they are absolutely on edge. They're armed to the teeth, and they will use every means at their disposal to perpetuate the system that keeps them on top and keeps Blacks disempowered. Now look at the map. Okay, here's this map, and here's the state of South Carolina, 58% Black, 42% white. Although the political power is in the hands primarily of white people. Look at Mississippi, 55% Black, 45% white. Big surprise, the two states to secede first from the Union when Abraham Lincoln was elected, numero uno, South Carolina. Number two, Mississippi. They're very interested in maintaining their property. They're also very interested in maintaining their psychological status. And they're absolutely terrified of what's going to happen. I use the metaphor of a prison system, where you don't need uniforms when you have different skin color. And okay, that person's white, they must be a guard. That person's Black, they must be a prisoner. That's the kind of way that it worked. If the prison is demolished, if the prison is declared illegal, then everyone's running around free, those white people are terrified. In the same way that guards are terrified by the possibility of a prison riot. What are those prisoners going to do when they get the power and they want to exact some revenge on the people who were controlling them? Okay, I hope that that there was so much material to cover in all of this, but I hope that a number of points got through. Does anybody have any other question that you'd like to ask?
I have a statement or a thought. One of the Civil War was fought almost exclusively by non-slave owners. And you were entitled to a draft deferment if you have a certain number of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And going back a step, the North is kind of given a pass as not having a hand in slavery. The South grew the cotton, the gin cleaned the cotton, but it was turned into a product in the North. So they were benefiting from slavery on one hand, and also saying, growing abolitionists.
Mm-hmm.
But the observation in my mind of one of the births of really racism, if there is a news broadcast from Haiti, look at the crowds. Those people are very Black. And the reason that there's not mixed race people was that when the Haitian slave revelation took place,
they left
or were murdered.
Yeah.
No,
that's exactly right. That's why, on most Caribbean islands, when things were changing and the power structure was being kind of completely upended, they left. In that sense, order was racialized on those islands. I mean, clearly it's going to be racialized in a enslavement when you have racial slavery. Actually, this brings up something that I didn't mention. Let me just say this quickly. So in between 1790 and 1860, 70, those are 70 years. And I talked about poor whites and the kind of role of racism in poor whites experiencing a status boost in the South. This is also true in the North, and I'm not meaning to pick on this group. I like these people very much, but the Irish. And why I mention the Irish is they were some of the poorest people in Europe. The English clearly treated the Irish pretty horribly, but they're dirt poor. And then there's a potato famine in the 1840s, and they have to get out of there to not starve to death. When the Irish got to America, they pretty quickly became some of the most racist people around. And the reason why it's not difficult to explain is in America, they experienced another status boost simply by arriving in America. And, oh, hey, there are these other people who are kind of kicked at or picked on and kicked more frequently than we are, and they're Blacks. So there's this very strong, unfortunate racist culture within Irish culture that I believe is straight up comes from the desire to keep one group at least one rung on the ladder lower than you, and that makes you feel better about yourself. Again, I'm not saying saying horrible things about the Irish, but just that is a certain human phenomenon of seeking some kind of status and holding on to that status.
But yet one of the tools in the Civil War to create animosity against the Black was the lesson of Haiti.
Yeah.
Where white people were murdered or fled, and mixed race people fled as well. That's why when you see the crowds in a news shot of Haiti, they are very dark skinned.
Yeah, and almost I don't know what the pie chart of Haiti's demographics would look like, but it's got to be 90 whatever percent Black. I don't know, what the small population of white folks there would be.
But you were saying one thing, Stewart, you were saying that those were one of the places where there were much more absentee landlords. So was it so much murdered, or was it, I'm sure that was part of the imagery without question, but it seems like a lot of them maybe weren't there in the first place and ran when things started falling apart.
Different islands that were part of different empires have different stories. So the British emancipated their slaves in the 1830s and did so in this gradual compensated emancipation. Other places it happened differently, and I don't know what all those stories are. I do know this. I teach on the Haitian Revolution. I have to rely on my notes for that because it is. If anybody here knows anything about the Haitian Revolution, that it is insanely complicated. I mean, it's just an absolute mess of then other countries get involved in Haiti, the Spanish and the British get involved, and it's Blacks versus Blacks. It's at certain points, it's just ridiculously complicated.
America gets involved.
Yeah, the United States gets involved as well. No, good point. But so it doesn't lend itself to an easy story or lessons can be taken from it, but it's not. And people would say. And Southern slave owners definitely said, "Look what happened in Haiti. See that could happen to us," and we're terrified of that. It was very spoken kind of in hushed tones because he didn't want to give the possibility more oxygen. But it was terrifying to people.
In 1850, my great grandparents came from Kentucky. With their slaveholders, German slaveholders, Whizzakers, their name was, and migrated to or established in Victoria, Texas. And at that time, I'm thinking with, I don't know what exactly they were growing, if anything, in Kentucky, but I think because of the cotton that was in Texas, that became something that was more, profitable.
Mhm.
That's what they did. But they were also, by just prior to 1865, they were given land, of their own by their slaveholders to live.
Hmm.
But they still, they were there for a while and worked on that land.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Yeah, my own family history, I don't know it as well as I should. I don't think anyone in my more immediate family tree was a slaveholder in the South. And they actually, because I lived in Birmingham and Dana is in Alabama, Birmingham is actually an iron and steel town, and my family were miners. They were coal miners and steel miners, and they kind of followed the Appalachian Mountains down from Pittsburgh, from the north, and followed the Appalachian Mountains down and ended up in Alabama. It's ironic because I'm claustrophobic. I wouldn't go in a mine to save my life.
Don't blame you.
Any other questions? Okay, where I wanted to bring things, there's again a million things that I didn't talk about. There's a million things to be talked about that you just can't fit into an hour. But the point I want to make about this is, again, the relation of money, power, and race. And that when cynicism is a occupational hazard that comes with the study of history. You can just reduce everybody to greedy, horrible moneymakers. I think life and the past and human beings are much more complicated than that. But some of these patterns do unfortunately hold true, including with some of the stuff we're talking about tonight. Next week, what I'm going to talk about is, okay, so the institution of slavery ends, it's abolished. What is the history of racism after that? And in particular, in the 90 years in between 1865 and 1955. And I choose 1865 is the end of the Civil War. 1955 is the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. So these are actually pretty dark, unpleasant times for Black people. But I'm also going to talk about plenty of other forms of racism, including, and actually I'm going to focus in particular on California, because we're in California. I teach California history, and it actually is, I kind of turn it into a joke. Maybe you'll find it funny, maybe you won't. But I'm from Alabama, a place with and from Birmingham in particular, a place with a really troubled racial past. Thankfully, I've moved to California, where nothing bad racially has ever happened. It's bad. I mean, it's just interesting that we forget about it. California moves so fast that oh yeah, there's that horrible thing we did to the Chinese and that horrible thing we did to the, kind of fill in the blank, and it just gets plowed under and not remembered. And again, this is not to, I think, I can't tell, but I think that all of us in this class right now are white. Again, nothing wrong with that. But I do want us to, I'm not trying to encourage white guilt. I'm not trying to do that. What I am trying to do is encourage greater historical understanding of why our world is the way that it is now. And when people of color are very, very unhappy about a system that they say is failing them, to understand the history behind the construction of that system, and to think critically about the justice or injustice of that system, I think is a worthwhile endeavor, especially in a church, especially for Christians. Any other questions? Okay.
I'll just say I'm looking forward to what you're going to say about the California experience, having as a fourth generation Californian. I'll tell you that my grandmother, I think, would have rather seen me date a Black guy than a Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah.
She wouldn't have been happy with either one, but yeah.
No, and that says a lot about proximity. And that says a lot about status and okay, I'd rather you marry somebody the culture gets built up such that these are the people that we just do not want to associate with, and God forbid we could never have our child be a part of that.
Yeah.
My wife and daughter are here now, so I need to go. So
Thank you, Stewart.
Thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to next week.
here, let me there she is.
Very
Aw,
Hi.
what's her name?
Say hello, Shiloh.
Hi,
Hi,
Shiloh.
Shiloh.
Hi.
gave her a good historical name.
Yeah. Actually, the subject that we're talking about right now inspired the name. Oh, I can explain that at a future time.
That's cute. She's
Okay.
precious.
Alrighty.
Uh-huh.
Thanks,
Bye,
everybody.
Shiloh.
From hair making.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Right.
Michelle.